So good morning and good afternoon and good evening to all of our participants around the world. We are now up to about 60 attendees. We had about 250 sign up, so I imagine we have more who will be joining us. We are so happy to see such high interest. I think it really underscores the importance and the interest in this really important topic of paying for education outcomes at scale. Let me start by introducing myself. My name is Emily Gustafsson-Wright. I'm a fellow here at the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution based in Washington, D.C. I lead a team that conducts policy research that aims to ensure that all young children achieve the education and other services that they need to be successful in life. Since 2014, I have dedicated much of my research to social and development impact bonds, attempting to better understand their potential limitations, as well as the critical considerations for their design and implementation. So today's webinar will last about an hour and a half. I will start off by providing you with a presentation which gives some of the highlights from a report that we have published today on our website, and also includes some data, the landscape of impact bonds, and give a little bit of a background to the origin of impact bonds and their definition. This will be followed by a panel discussion of the India Education Impact Bond practitioners, which will be moderated by my colleague Izzy Boggild-Jones. And then we will open up a discussion to the audience for about 10 minutes of Q&A. And at that point, you can feel free to type any questions that you have into the Q&A box in your Zoom. And after this, I will moderate a panel discussion with India education experts, and that will also be followed by an audience Q&A, and then my closing remarks. Before I jump into the presentation, I would like to recognize the generous support of British Asian Trust and the UBS Optimus Foundation of our research, and also just emphasize Brookings' commitment to independence and underscore that the views today are solely those of the speakers. So here is our report that I said you can find on the Brookings website. We are thrilled to launch that today. So I will start off by summarizing some of our key points in the report and our findings, exploring this really important topic. So education in India. In 2009, the Right to Education Act in India placed a legal obligation on government to ensure that children ages 6 to 14 attend and complete free elementary education. This led to high levels of enrollment, so about 97% for elementary students and about 80% for secondary, meaning that they are unable to read and understand a simple text by the age of 10. And there are also huge disparities in the country. According to ASER in 2019, nearly 3/4 of rural children in grade 3 cannot read at grade level. The new draft National Education Policy in 2019 emphasizes the importance of early childhood, as well as foundational literacy and numeracy. And it restates a commitment of reaching 6% of GDP spend on education, which is the commitment, which we have been seeing until now, public expenditure on education at about 3% of GDP. And also the policy also recommends raising public expenditure from 10 to 20, the percent of public expenditure from 10% to 20% over 10 years. As you can see in this slide, there are huge disparities, as I said, across the country. In northern India, for example, only 77% of children in grade 5 are reading at a grade 2 level. while 34% only in Eastern India are reading at grade 5 level in that year. So this really highlights the importance and also notably the important role of spending in states, where 75% of public education spending comes from states. So the question that we're really trying to ask here at Brookings is, can paying for outcomes address this learning crisis? We have two hypotheses. The first is that a focus on outcomes can achieve greater impact. And the second, paying for outcomes increases the effectiveness of resource use. This is what led us to research impact bonds and outcome-based financing. So I'll start by giving a little bit of a background or a primer on impact bonds. For some, this may be very new. For others, this may be less new, and some have, perhaps much more knowledge about impact bonds. But to ensure that we're all on the same page, impact bonds are a form of results-based financing. There are many types of results-based financing. The concept of results-based financing is not new. As you can see here, the concept of results-based financing is where funding is tied to pre-agreed and verified results. There are a multitude of types of results-based financing: results-based aid, performance-based contracts, performance-based loans, performance-based grants. And these all differ in who it is that holds the risk for not achieving the outcomes. So social and development impact bonds are forms of results-based financing. And the way that we usually describe them is that they're a confluence of three things: impact investing, which is investing that aims to achieve both a social and a financial return, public-private partnership, and payment by results that we just described. So how does an impact bond work? So we like to sort of simplify things and talk about these three main actors: the investor, the service provider, and the outcome funder or outcome payer. So in an impact bond, the investor provides upfront capital to a service provider who will deliver services to the population in need. Then an independent evaluation is done, verifying whether or not some pre-agreed impact metrics have been achieved. If those have been achieved, then the outcome funder pays the investor their principal plus in return. If they haven't been achieved, they do not generally pay that principal and return back, or some portion of it. In the case of a social impact bond, the outcome funder is a government, while in the case of a development impact bond, the outcome funder is a third party, such as a donor agency, for example, a DFID or the World Bank or USAID, or a foundation. So that's how it works. In addition to these three parties, you often have an intermediary party, which can help structure the deal, bring all of these players together. The intermediary can also play the role of performance manager, working closely with the service provider to ensure that outcomes are achieved, building their capacity around data collection and performance management. You often also have lawyers who play an important role given the contracting that is done between the different parties, sometimes additional technical service providers, and the independent evaluator. So there are two impact bonds for education in India. Globally, we are tracking in our Global Impact Bonds database as of November 1st, 170 impact bonds across 31 countries. Of those, 15 are in developing countries, and 9 of which are development impact bonds or DIBs, and 6 of which are social impact bonds. So of those, 3 impact bonds have been contracted in India, but in terms of beneficiaries, they represent 90% of impact bonds in developing countries. And as I said, there are 2 of those impact bonds are for education. So the first impact bond for education is the Educate Girls Development Impact Bond. It was the first impact bond in education, a development impact bond in education, and the second development impact bond globally. We have been following this closely since its early years of design and its and launch. We've hosted a couple of webinars and a launch event last year with the final results. So this impact bond, as you can see, has these 5 players that you can see on the left-hand side: Educate Girls as the service provider, UBS Optimist Foundation as the investor, the Children's Investment Fund Foundation as the outcome funder, Instiglio playing the intermediary role that I just described, and ID Insight as the evaluator. So this impact bond took place in Rajasthan, India, benefiting over 7,000 children in grades 3 to 5. The upfront capital commitment was $270,000 US, and outcome funds over $400,000. So the metrics for this, we're looking at verified enrollment as well as learning achievement. The impact bond are the services Educate Girls within this impact bond overachieved in terms of both the enrollment and the learning outcomes. In terms of learning outcomes, in fact, they reached 160% of the target. So the Quality Education India Development Impact Bond, you can see on the left-hand side, has quite a few more players that are involved. It's also much larger in size, covering multiple states in India, Delhi, Gujarat, Maharashtra, and Uttar Pradesh, and targeting 200,000 students in grades 1 to 8. This is, as I said, you can see there are many more players. So we have 4 service providers in this impact bond, providing a variety of interventions, which is also interesting and new in the impact bond space. So there are several interventions: direct operation of learning centers, remedial education, a school leadership intervention, as well as a computer-based adaptive learning intervention. The impact metrics for this look at learning improvements in literacy and numeracy relative to a comparison group. And you can see that in terms of upfront capital and in terms of the outcome funds, again, it is much larger. So the upfront capital is at $3 million and the outcome funds at $9.2 million. For this impact bond, again, UBS Optimist Foundation is playing the role as the investor. And then there are multiple outcome funders. The British Asian Trust brings together a consortium of outcome funders, including Tata Trust, Comic Relief, the Mittal Foundation, and British Telecom. And then the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation also is an outcome funder. You have Dahlberg, which is playing the role of intermediary around performance management, and Grey Matters India, which is doing the impact evaluation. So what have we learned so far about impact bonds in the world? We have, as I said, been researching impact bonds for the last 5 years. When we started our research 5 years ago, we identified what we call the 10 common claims around impact bonds. So in the sort of gray literature around impact bonds, we came across these 10 claims, which were what was being written about what impact bonds could achieve. What we did in our first report, which we published in 2015, looking at the first 5 years of impact bonds, we tested those claims against what we were seeing across the market. And we have continued to do so over the last 5 years to see what is happening in the impact bond market globally. So what we have found is that these first 5 claims is where we see demonstrated evidence. So we see that impact bonds are really focusing on outcomes. And because of that focus on outcomes, they're really building a culture of monitoring and evaluation and are really driving performance management. So within these service providers, the need to achieve those outcomes is clear. Also, because service providers are provided that upfront capital, they have the flexibility to work to achieve those outcomes. And we really see that impact bonds are also really incentivizing collaboration across the different actors that are involved, across public and private sector, across government agencies sometimes, and across multiple service providers that are all aligned in terms of the achievement of these outcomes. Finally, we see that impact bonds are on average really investing in preventive services. In particular, obviously those that are starting very early, so impact bonds that focus on young children are the most preventive, and others later on that are really trying to prevent poor outcomes, poor and costly outcomes from occurring later down the road. There are two claims that we think it's a little bit soon to say. We see some evidence in terms of reducing risk for government. So this generally is referring to financial risk. There are only 2 impact bonds that have not achieved outcomes in the contract period of the 50 impact bonds that have reached the end of contract to date. So of the 170 impact bonds contracted globally, 50 of those have reached the end of contract. Only 2 did not achieve the outcomes. So in those cases, we could say that the government didn't pay for outcomes that weren't achieved. So that's a clear reduction in financial risk for government. But we don't know for the other impact bonds whether or not outcomes would have been achieved in the absence of the impact bond. And in general, and then in terms of sustaining impact, we see that impact bonds, most impact bonds are not following the beneficiaries past the impact bond periods. It's a little bit hard to say, but in general, we might say that some of the sort of ecosystem effects that we're seeing, such as improved collaboration and performance management capacity increasing, et cetera, could be related to sustained impact. Where we are seeing less evidence is impact bonds crowding in additional private funding. So while we may see new actors getting engaged in particular sectors or issue areas, because outcome funders are paying for the outcomes at the end of the day, it's not necessarily additional private funding. Most of the impact bonds are quite small, so we're not seeing that they're achieving scale, although as you could see in the Quality Education India, DIB is aiming to reach 200,000 children, so that is much larger than many of the impact bonds. The majority of them are reaching less than 500 individuals, so they're quite small, but we're happy to see that there are some much larger impact bonds. And then finally, we're not seeing a lot of evidence of impact bonds supporting very experimental interventions, meaning that most of the impact bonds thus far have pretty strong evidence behind them, which seems to be sort of what impact investors that are engaging in the impact bond space are really looking for services that they see will achieve the outcomes. So some challenges have come up around the impact bond space. So because impact bonds really should target specific marginalized populations, one of the concerns is that service providers may target individuals who are more likely to achieve outcomes. So one of the first questions is, do impact bonds encourage perverse incentives? And some evidence has emerged in the UK that supports this critique. However, on average, we're not seeing that. Some of the design factors within impact bonds really are aimed at preventing that from happening. And so that means really tightly defining the beneficiary group and rewarding progress rather than thresholds. Another of the concerns is the time and expense that's related to impact bonds. So there's really a need to sort of weigh the benefits and the costs. There's not a lot of information of costs, but so improved data around that, I think, is really important. But also really thinking about what those benefits are, which often are quite qualitative in nature and difficult to measure. So the things I mentioned, such as improved performance management, for example, improved collaboration, are hard to measure, and so just important to take those into consideration. And then finally, is data collection for service providers burdensome? And so the question is sort of how to relieve that burden on the service providers, but also thinking about really how to empower and build the capacity of service providers in that process. So just a few things we have in the report. We think a lot about sort of the application of impact bonds to education in India, and analyzing what the facilitating factors may be for that. We highlight three facilitating factors. There are, of course, many other aspects that need to be taken into consideration, but we think these are three key factors that should be looked at, in particular thinking about the context in India. So the first one, ready and able education service providers. So for impact bonds to scale, you need to have a pool of education service providers that are ready and able to engage in this outcome-based financing way. So, so perhaps it would be helpful for financing to get some service providers ready. And obviously this is also part of the impact bond process, but we have, there's been evidence around the world of specific investment that is aimed at helping service providers get prepared, particular impact bonds where an intermediary has worked with the service provider, helping them to get ready before the launch of the impact bond, etc. So that's a really important aspect, and something I think that we should pay close attention to in the coming years as this space expands. The second is around technology for data collection, analysis, and action. So this relates to that question of burden on the service providers and also cost. So really thinking about how can data be collected efficiently and accurately, and thinking about how the potential of technology to reduce that cost and the accuracy of the data collection. And then third is the essential role of government. So really important, in particular in contexts that, really to achieve scale, government really is going to have to be involved. And so the willingness of government to engage is quite important. Important to engage, to ensure that outcomes are aligned with the priorities of government stakeholders. And there are different ways that governments can engage. For example, in the Educate Girls Impact Bond, they were involved. They had an MOU, and they were really looking at ways that how the importance of engaging the government from early on and thinking about this, and the quality education India did. Some of the interventions are in government schools, and so that's a way to really begin to engage government. So from our perspective, we think that impact bonds really have the potential to incentivize stakeholders to work together, to focus on outcomes, and build performance management among service providers. Impact bonds seem to be most suitable to services that are preventive in nature, and have a strong need for adaptation to individual needs, and result in easily measured but meaningful outcomes. So the three factors that I just mentioned will, for an impact bond market to flourish, will play a really important role, we think, in the growth of outcome-based financing for education in India, where there are 370 million young people between the ages of 0 and 14 and so the issue of scale is really a crucial consideration. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Izzy Boggild-Jones, who is a senior research analyst on my team here at Brookings. And she will introduce the first panel, who will be providing the practitioner perspective.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Emily. And I'm thrilled to be joined by such a fantastic group of panelists today discussing practitioners' perspectives on paying for education outcomes at scale in India. Now, the full bios of our esteemed panelists can be found on the event page in a PDF. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of who we have today joining us. And just as a reminder, please, if you're in the audience and want to ask questions to our panelists, feel free to add those to the chat, and we'll have some time for audience Q&A later. So today we are joined by Abha Thorat-Shah, who's Executive Director of Social Finance at the British Asian Trust. She's been a key driver of innovative finance mechanisms at the Trust, including the Quality Education India DIB. Pankaj Jain is the founder and chief executive of Gustafsson-Wright, an NGO educating children living in slums across 9 cities in India. Gustafsson-Wright is one of the service providers in the Quality Education India DIB. Maya Ziswala is head of social impact finance at the UBS Optimus Foundation, where she spearheaded the foundation's work on the Educate Girls DIB. And as a reminder, UBS Optimus Foundation has provided upfront capital for all 3 of the contracted impact bonds in India. And finally, Kate Sterler is a director on the innovation team at ID Insight, where she leads the organization's results-based financing strategy. She also managed the evaluation of the Educate Girls DIB. So I'm going to start by turning to Abha and reminding everyone that BAT convened a group of funders for the Quality Education India DIB, including Tata Trust, British Telecom, Comic Relief, and the Mittal Foundation, alongside the anchor outcome funder, the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation. So, Abha, can you tell us why such a large group of organisations were interested in engaging in an impact bond, and perhaps talk us through the specific problem you were trying to solve and why an impact bond was the right mechanism there?
Thank you, and I thought it's better to turn my video on and see the 100-odd people who are here. It's all very exciting doing this on Zoom. So I'll answer the question in 2 parts. Why were a large group of funders interested? The correct question is actually, were a large group of funders interested? To start with, UBS Optimus had managed to show impact and results with the Educate Girls DIB. And when they approached us to develop a program which was at scale, we felt that there was value in bringing funding together for that, because one of the challenges we'd been facing is funding individual nonprofits for scale and not being able to drive that at the British Asian Trust. So our starting point was, is scale possible? And working in partnership, is that possible? Emily covered several of the points. The 2 main points which she said, and which was really a driving factor for many of the funders, was the focus on results. Does it drive better performance? And does the focus on outcome financing ensure better use of the current resources that are there? Can we really, really ensure that the money that we have and the way we use the money is better, is much more effective? Those were really the driving forces for every single funder. The difference in usual grant funding is everybody decides to focus on learning outcomes in very different ways. And the one amazing factor in this DIB is that we all had to come together upfront, agree as to what we meant by learning outcomes, how we would measure it, how we would collaboratively do it, and then leave the nonprofits to focus on what they were doing best, which is delivering the outcomes. Funders are not driving the agenda here. The nonprofits and the performance managers are, which is really exceptional, because otherwise it's an agenda that's driven by a grant maker. And we really wanted to drive a culture which was adaptive learning and delivery of work for nonprofits, as against funder-driven, let's do a log frame and let you deliver to my agenda. And we are trying to prove that with this DIB. Can we really do that? Can we agree outcomes and then let the sector deliver the outcomes and the results, with the private sector taking on the rest? Those are the big ideas. The other bits about India, Emily covered very, very clearly about why India was a great place. The service providers were able. We had great evaluators. We had Michael and Susan Dell's foundations data for 10 years of doing education financing that enabled us to build some of the models. And now increasingly willingness of government to engage as well. So for us, it was a market ripe and ready to do it, and to bring players together and to be one of the cementing factors was a real pleasure, actually, and it continues to be that.
Thank you. So Pankaj, I'd like to turn to you next. The QEI DIB is the first impact bond project that your organisation, Gustafsson-Wright, has engaged in. And could you tell us about why an outcome-based contract was of interest to your organisation, and in what ways you've had to adapt over the first year?
See, we started the organizations around 20 years back. And from the very beginning, we decided to be accountable for the learning outcome. And therefore, from the beginning, we have been asking outside independent assessment agencies to check the performance of our children and give us feedback how well they are performing. So the organization as such has been sort of committed to producing the outcome and getting those assessed by the outsiders. So that part was sort of in line with this current div also, and so it was in some sense very convenient. You people have already covered why the div is important as a concept, as an instrument to improve the efficiency of resource use and hopefully trigger greater focus on the outcome, even for the organization like ours, which was already committed to that particular goal. And I do find that we have been a partner in this process only for 1 year. And in spite of the fact that our organization was designed from the beginning to focus on the outcome, there have been significant changes in the way we have addressed this issue. One impact what we have found is that once there is a sort of independent, a fairly well laid out process of outside people coming and making an assessment not only on the outcome but also the process which is done by one of the partner helper, it sort of creates a culture in the organization of accountability, which ultimately would lead to the organization being accountable. So building a culture of accountability at the different level, I think, is a significant aspect which we have observed, which probably did not exist as intensely as it now exists in the past.
Thank you, Pankaj. I'm going to turn to Maya next, and my UBS Optimus Foundation has played the role of an investor across all 3 of the contracted impact bonds in India and engaged in a range of other projects and design. So can you tell us what motivated the foundation to engage in impact bonds and perhaps the 2 most important things you've learned so far?
Sure, thank you. So as a foundation, our objective is to try and bring in new and better funding to the development sector. What we mean by that is new money, i.e. money that wouldn't have gone to the sector otherwise, and better money that is accountable for delivering results and outcomes. And so thinking of innovative financing mechanism that can incentivize a focus on outcomes is kind of core to our strategy. And impact bonds, alongside other outcomes-linked instruments, we believe can change the way that social impact is being funded from a donor perspective as well as a, investor perspective, hopefully. We were the first to test the impact bond model in an emerging country context, and I think we were attracted by this potential to align stakeholders on the focus on results rather than inputs and activities, and also the accountability and transparency of such a mechanism. Ultimately, I think our ambition in the longer term is to be able to create a market for outcomes where social impact is actually driving financial returns. As a foundation that is linked to a financial institution, we believe we have the flexibility to test these new models, build evidence around what works with them, and then try to then transition into scale, either through UBS by using the large financial distribution platform, but also through other partners, governments and donors. So that's a little bit on the motivation of why we got engaged. In terms of the 2 things that we've learned, we've learned a lot of lessons. Definitely it's been a long journey, but maybe zooming into two aspects. One, and this may seem obvious, but making sure that the evaluation is designed well is critical. All stakeholders, especially the service providers, need to fully understand it. It needs to be able to be explained more easily, and it has to be a tool that is not only used for the evaluation purposes, but also can help actually improve the implementation of the program. Of course, as with every evaluation, it needs to be piloted and calibrated before the actual implementation starts. And it needs to be designed not to incentivize the easiest to reach. So in our example, both with Educate Girls actually and the Quality Education India DIB, we focused on improvement in learnings rather than absolute learning levels. And that was a conscious decision so that we would not incentivize service providers to focus on the easiest to reach. The second point, and I think this is a bigger point around the fact that it's really a broader change management project. So it is changing the way that all partners think about their processes, holding them all accountable, and focused on delivering outcomes. So beyond the service providers, the intermediaries need to shift away from a consulting mindset focused on deliverables that are agreed upon beforehand to one that's really focused on outcomes. The outcome funders who are used to activity or output-based fundings are being challenged in their entire grant-making processes. And the investor, of course, is focused on ensuring the performance management and broader support is the best it can be. And as mentioned earlier, the evaluator is also being held accountable and challenged to ensure that the data and the methodology are accurate. So it is really, people talk a lot about, transaction costs being high and is it worth the cost? I would argue that we're not talking about transaction costs for an individual project. We're talking about a broader change in mindset around the way that implementation is being delivered, and the costs of change management is bigger than what is just attributed to one individual program or impact fund.
Great, thank you, Maya. So Kate, ID Insight ran the evaluation for the Educate Girls DIB, and you continue to work with the organisation on data collection and analysis. So I'd like to ask you about one of the facilitating factors that Emily mentioned, which is the role of technology for data collection. Could you outline how ID Insight's been using technology for data collection within India and some opportunities and challenges in this area?
Yeah, thanks. Well, first, I just want to acknowledge some really great points from Maya. I couldn't agree more on the need for thoughtful, transparent evaluation that measures and incentivizes real results and impact, and that's inclusive of marginalized populations that otherwise might get left out. And I think that, obviously the foundation of any good evaluation is having high quality data. And I think there's rightfully a lot of excitement around the potential for technology to make data collection cheaper and faster. That said, I think in the context in which we work, we found that more technological approaches aren't always optimal. I think it can be easy to assume that a more technological approach is going to be better or more equitable or cheaper. That's not always the case. And I think to Maya's point, the approach you choose can really shape incentives around reaching more challenging populations. And so I think that's another reason to be really thoughtful and flexible about which approach you use when. So I think that's illustrated on the Educate Girls DIB, where we actually used a variety of approaches. We used publicly available government data. When we were selecting our initial sample of villages, we validated data collected by Educate Girls for the enrollment measure. And then we did direct data collection using a digital platform for learning outcomes. So I think that, one thing I want to highlight when I talk about digital data collection in this context is that there are a lot of challenges to collecting high quality data, especially from small children, on something as precise as learning outcomes, not all of which can be addressed with technological fixes. So, we sometimes just have logistical challenges in reaching populations, floods preventing us from reaching certain schools. But then on a more granular level, there are children who don't have high quality ID documents, which makes it harder to track them, from year to year. And so we had to deploy a lot of different approaches. And then specifically for collecting learning data from the students in our evaluation, we wanted to be thoughtful about kind of making assumptions about how they were going to interact with technology. So even though we were doing digital data collection, we made a decision that the students we were surveying would only interact with a paper copy of the survey, of the assessment, and then report their answers back to our surveyor, who then inputted it into a mobile phone. So I think there's these kind of hybrid solutions that can address kind of concerns about equity and reach, while still having a lot of the efficiency gains of taking a more technological solution. So by doing digital data collection in this case, that meant that we were able to upload, analyze, clean data in real time, and then importantly, catch any quality issues quickly and in a time frame where we were still able to go back and resurvey if necessary.
Great. Thank you, Kate. Pankaj, I'm going to turn back to you and raise one of the things that Emily brought up in the presentation, which was sometimes people say that impact bonds as a financing mechanism might incentivize service providers to work with those beneficiaries who are the most likely to achieve outcomes, and therefore excluding those perhaps most in need of intervention. So can you explain how Guy and Charlotte works to ensure that all children are achieving, and how you identify and support those who most need help?
Well, Gyanshala was designed to essentially work with the children who are out of the school, which means who are not going in the school. And given the whole focus of the government, at least in the last 1 decade, already the admissions of the children has been made very, very easy, which is reflected in almost a universal enrollment in India, which is almost 97%. Now, given the fact that we are working with the children who are not attending other schools, itself means that we are probably working with the children who are difficult to be reached by other mechanisms of enrolling the children. So that's the primary part. Second thing, our program was designed to eliminate the roadblocks which come in the way of children attending the schools. And obviously, the children who come from the disadvantaged sections are the ones who face these problems more, whether it is the girls, whether it is minorities, and so on and so forth. Typically, we choose the communities in which we work, where we find that even if a child is enrolled, but he or she is not actually attending the school. So the way we go about is that we sort of go to the community during the school hours. And if we find a lot of children on the street during the school hours, we take as a surrogate indicator that the child actually is not attending the classes or the school. And that's how we normally choose our area of work. Second thing that we have decided that our classrooms or the schools will be located within the community, which reduces the major barrier for the girls attending the schools, because many parents do not want to send the girls outside the community setting. So both on the side of that, we are focused on the children who are in fact difficult to reach, and therefore they are out of the school. And second, by eliminating some of the factors which prohibit the child from attending the school, hopefully we are addressing that problem of not reaching those which are easier to reach.
Great. Thank you. So Maya, turning back to you, another one of the facilitating factors for impact bonds that we identified in the report was the role of ready and able service providers. UBS Optimus Foundation was an investor in both the Educate Girls DIB and the Quality Education India DIB. So you've gained a good overview of the landscape of education service providers in India. What have you learned about service provider readiness for contracting on outcomes?
Yeah, thanks. I think first of all, we really went through a very thorough selection process to identify service providers that we feel are ready for outcomes contracting. So maybe to outline some of the key criteria that we've identified. So first of all, a track record of delivering outcomes, and going hand in hand with that is strong monitoring and evaluation capabilities. Maybe the second category is looking at, an organization's ability to sustain impact. And there we looked at alignment and relationship with government, the ability to scale, i.e. an organization's execution capability, and also its cost effectiveness. Thirdly, and I think very importantly, is the organizational culture. So is there buy-in from senior leadership? Is there a strong culture of learning and flexibility? And with that in mind, there aren't actually that many organizations that fit those criteria, even in India, that has a very sophisticated education service provider market. So that's why we think the role of the performance manager is critical to shift that mindset to outcomes contracting, looking at live data collection and analysis, ongoing course correction. It's essential, and it's even difficult for established organization. I think in addition to the role of the performance manager, I think which is critical at the individual DIB level, there's also a need to build capacity more broadly around outcomes contracting. And so through some of the work that the Impact Bond Working Group has done, a number of large donors have agreed that, three key pillars should be prioritized. One is, putting together a global knowledge sharing platform as a go-to resources for those that are considering outcomes contracting. There's actually a beta version that is live on Oxford University's GoLab website. That's one. So, global knowledge sharing platform. Number two is an accelerator, which could help provide funding to help design impact bonds, including funding for service providers who often have to fund that capacity building work themselves. And the third pillar is really looking at a scalable mechanism to pool funding, both on the outcomes funding side and the investment side. And there are several initiatives that are underway there, including the World Bank that is launching an outcomes fund of several $100 million, as well as ourselves looking at $100 million investment fund in that area. So I think that the capacity building piece is essential, as well as the role of the performance manager in summary.
Thank you, Maya. Back to Abba. I'd like to ask about the facilitating factor that Emily identified, which was the willingness of government to engage. Can you tell us more about how the government has been engaged in the Quality Education India DIB, and where you see the future role of government in outcome-based financing in education?
Sure. I'll answer both those questions, and I'll answer that picking up on the points that Maya raised earlier about mindset shifts. To be taken seriously by government in the impact bond space, you needed to show scale. And the first thing this DIB does is shows scale and shows variety. And I think that was one of our driving factors, is that if we wanted to create a market in India for social impact bonds in the future, where government is the ultimate outcome payer, we needed to show that this works at scale, works with large number of providers delivering different kinds of inputs and projects aligned on similar outcomes. Only then would you have some level of leverage to say this is of value. And we could then advocate for the use of this wider than single individual nonprofits using it to deliver single individual interventions. So that's one thing. So in terms of government, today we are using the data that's coming out of our results as well as our performance management work to advocate to government as to how this can be used at scale and how it can be used effectively at scale. A little interesting anecdotes there is, when you start thinking about scale, it is not innovation in terms of delivery of programs. Pankaj and Gyanshala are delivering very outcome-focused programs, but it's the innovation when you take it to scale and the process innovation that you require to take the organization to scale or the project to scale that we're seeing with some of the other nonprofits that we are working with. So that is vital. The second piece is 3 out of the 4 service providers that we're working with are working in government schools. So the government is a partner automatically by enabling those partnerships for those NGOs to work there. And that enables us to show, again, reaching the last mile, because children who are going to government schools are those who are absolutely at the bottom of the pyramid. So we really think the fact that we're working within government schools is really an important part of this DIB, and hopefully something that adds value to the government in the future. One of the early ambitions of this DIB was to provide government with an education rate card in the future. So how much does one intervention cost? What value of outcome do they deliver, and over what period of time? And whether those could be compared against each other. The government actually was able to put data and understand the funding of different models. Today, when a nonprofit approaches governments, they can talk about their track record, but we would be able to allow them to show outcomes and the data that sits behind this DIB as a real feature of why they should be a partner to government. Those are few points. There are several more as we learn on this DIB, but those are sort of early reasons where we felt government would be a partner. Finally, of course, the new education policy, putting outcomes in the center of the conversation there, is a huge step forward in India, and we really, we welcome that as a consortium, and we hope that our DIB can add value to the policy as it's implemented going forward.
Thank you. So, Kate, one of the key hypothesized benefits of paying for education outcomes is that donors and governments can feel secure that their funding is going towards the most effective services or interventions. But one challenge here is attribution. How do we know that the impact bond or even the intervention is actually doing the work without rigorous and often expensive evaluation? How else can we think about validating education outcomes at scale?
Yeah, well, I guess I'll push back a little bit on one part of that question, which is that I think rigorous doesn't always have to mean expensive. And on the flip side, I think sometimes we underestimate the costs of a less rigorous approach. And I'm thinking here specifically about how transaction costs can go up if you wind up with unreliable or contested results in a really high stakes environment like a DIB. So, of course, attribution means having a reasonable idea of what would have happened in the absence of an intervention. That usually means you need a plausible comparison. And the most reliable way to do this, the kind of Nobel-approved approach, is a randomized controlled trial, which is what we did to measure learning outcomes on the Educate Girls DIB. But it is possible to use other quasi or non-experimental approaches as well. And I think it depends a lot on the context that you're operating in. I think when you do choose to use like a non-randomized approach, I think that it's really important to understand the underlying assumptions, how strong those assumptions are, and what the risks are and who bears those risks. So I'm thinking here specifically about the Educate Girls DIB evaluation, where we actually used, in addition to the randomized controlled trial to measure learning outcomes, just a simple before and after study to measure enrollment outcomes. And of course, the underlying assumption there is that if we're just capturing enrollment at the beginning and at the end of the program among a certain group of girls, that there's nothing else that might be impacting enrollment beyond the program that Educate Girls was implementing in those villages. I think this was a fairly strong assumption in this context, but it took a lot of contextual knowledge to know that girls ages 7 to 14 who are already out of school are highly unlikely to enroll on their own. That said, there were some risks to that assumption, and some of those risks were borne by Educate Girls. So had in the course of those 3 years there been some kind of external shock, let's say a drought took place and enrollment went down, we wouldn't have been able to capture the kind of added value of Educate Girls program over and above this kind of negative overall trend. And so I think that was a risk that we all went into with our eyes open about, but I think that anytime you're making decisions about, how to evaluate the results that you're going to base payments on, you need to be really thoughtful about those trade-offs and really think about whether the underlying assumptions are reasonable in that context. I think beyond just kind of your choice of methodology, there are lots of other ways to bring down costs. And I think that's why, again, I push back a little bit on the idea that rigorous evaluation is always going to be the most expensive option. So a couple just off the top of my head are, depending on the program size, usually the cost of the evaluation doesn't scale along with the cost of the program. So a larger program usually means that the evaluation is cheaper in relative to the overall costs. As we mentioned before, I think there's technological solutions to collect data kind of faster, more cheaply. And then I think there's a lot of evaluation decisions you can make, everything from how frequently you're going to collect data, whether it's possible to use existing government or administrative data. And then, of course, as Ava mentioned, I think there's a lot of scope to kind of take more standardized approaches to measurement, like rate cards that might be applicable across multiple projects. So I think there's a lot of room to kind of balance rigor against kind of the real world constraints of setting up these projects and come up with solutions that are appropriate for the given project and context.
Thank you, Kate. Great. So in the interest of time, I think I'm going to turn to some of these audience questions that are coming in. And just a reminder that we're going to turn over next to our second panel that Emily's doing moderating. So these are great questions. I'm just going to pick a couple of them. So perhaps there's a question here. Is there any concern about the potential for impact bonds to skew the focus from teaching and learning to testing used to show improved learning outcomes? I mean, I think any of our panelists could answer this. Abba or Maya, do you want to start off there, and Pankaj and Kate could jump in?
I'd be happy to take this one if I'm not talking over anyone else. Yeah, I think that's always a really valid concern. And I think, again, this is where contextual knowledge is really important. So I think for higher order skills, and especially for secondary education, I think that that's a really valid concern and something that we've thought about as we've kind of, approached DIBs that are meant to improve learning outcomes for older students. I think in the context of the Educate Girls DIB and a lot of like primary education programs, that's much less of a concern. And I think that's because it's pretty easy to test the foundational skills. And I think it's also possible to make the case that those are skills that are necessary, albeit not sufficient, for any other education that a child's going to receive. In the context of the EdDib, we were measuring really basic literacy and numeracy. And so even in a context where there might be like teaching to the test and really drilling kids on basic word and letter recognition, I think that's actually appropriate at that level. And then I think we weren't as worried about kind of shifting the focus away from teaching other skills in the way that we would be if we were, very narrowly testing a certain level of, like reading comprehension at the secondary level, where we also expect many other skills to be being taught.
Can I just add one thing? Nothing in an impact bond should take away from how the nonprofit delivers education, learning, teaching, whether you're a teaching training organization, you're delivering education yourself, you're doing remedial classes, or you're training principals, or you're providing ed tech. We are agnostic to input on an impact bond, but the test is similar for all inputs that are delivered within our impact bond. We would not want any kind of focus to move from the teaching and learning to a test, because the test selection of the schools where the testing is done is random and not told to the nonprofit until the end of when the test is actually happening. They have to do their work as they have to do it in all the schools that they operate in, and they can't really test, they can't really be preparing them for tests. So what our nonprofits actually tell us, and I'm sure Maya can add to that, is that it allows them to be far more flexible, because if they change something to deliver a program where they start finding out that they can't deliver a certain Hindi learning outcome because of the methodology that they pre-agreed, there's no reason to come back to an outcome funder. They can sit with a performance manager and change a method or change the way a budget is allocated. Huge flexibility to focus on what education is meant to do. The testing of the children in the end is just to make sure that the rigor of the learning level is assessed and therefore the right outcomes are incentivized. So I actually think it adds value as against less, but perhaps I'm a converter.
No, I totally agree with that. And I just wanted to add one additional thought. I think thinking about the way that the test is actually designed so that it is not about providing answers that can be, memorized and then spit out, but thinking about ways that the tests can actually measure an ability to think about problem solving, so that it's not just about, you can't just memorize your answer to the test, but you need to be able to have understood the concept. I think we spend quite a lot of time thinking about that with MSDF, with BAT, and with Grey Matters, the evaluator on the quality education DIB. So also just to add that as a thought as well.
Thank you. I think we've probably got time for one more question. We've had some really great ones. Perhaps this one that's just come in. Please share your thoughts on whether the affordable private school sector is ready for DIBs in India. And do you see any challenges with respect to willingness or availability of outcome funders for funding interventions in the private sector in India? So maybe, yeah, please, Maya, go ahead.
I'm happy to get us started, and others please jump in. I think, and Emily alluded to this at the beginning of the presentation, there are other mechanisms that can be used to help incentivize a focus on outcomes. In the case of affordable private schools that have a revenue model, it may be that you consider a different type of mechanism. You may be looking at an outcomes-linked loan or an impact loan, where the loan that you provide, the interest rate is linked to the ability of the organization to deliver outcomes. So just to throw out there that there are other ways to think about incentivizing a focus on outcomes and helping in this case, a social enterprise like an affordable private school to keep focusing on more marginalized populations by incentivizing that focus on learning rather than just on financial performance. So I hope that somewhat answers the question.
That's great. I just wanted to see if Pankaj wanted to come in on that before we close. You might be on mute, Pankaj.
Hello. Hello.
Hi, Pankaj. On the affordable private school sector,
Yeah.
what do you think?
There are not many sort of direct studies about the capability of the affordable private schools in India, but there is sort of indirect corroboration through, for example, this national level test which is conducted by Pratham to find out what is the average level of learning outcomes in the society as such. And whatever information that we get, that information is representative of almost the whole of, at least in the rural India, which includes both the private school as well as the children going to the government school. So the standard that we see that large number of children even in the grade 5 age are not able to attain the learning level of the grade 2 is not characteristic only of the children going to the government school. That actually is also applicable to the large number of the affordable private school, APN. So I am not sure from whatever little information that is available that private, particularly the low cost or affordable private schools, are really in a position to be able to take up the DIB kind of a funding mechanism.
Thank you. Well, thanks so much to all four of our excellent panelists for a really interesting and thoughtful discussion. I'm going to turn back over now to Emily, who is going to introduce and moderate our second panel.
Thanks so much, Izzy, and thanks to all the panelists. That was a fantastic conversation, and I think we could probably continue with all of you for another hour if we had time. So just such a rich discussion, I think. So I'm going to turn over now to our second panel. It's my pleasure to welcome two distinguished panelists who have really a deep expertise in the education sector in India. So Dr. Madhav Chavan is the co-founder and president of Pratham, and Praveen Kanta is the senior program manager and of strategy, learning, and partnerships at the Central Square Foundation. So I'm going to start with Dr. Chavan, and if you can, sorry. Dr. Chavan, can you hear me?
Yeah, I could hear you. Excellent. I can hear you.
Excellent. So, as one of the largest NGOs in India, Pratham has a great deal of experience in working at scale. The teaching at the right level model has reached over 60 million students in India and in Africa. So what are some of the challenges and opportunities of implementing effective interventions at scale? And how do you see the relationship to the work that you're doing with Pratham and this thinking around outcome-based financing and achieving scale?
I think one of the biggest problems has been the commitment of various governments to the outcome goals. They're not very well defined. Now the draft new education policy, and it's still a draft, it's not adopted by the government, is laying emphasis on some very important, well-defined outcomes. But by and large, the states, especially the states that are lagging behind educationally and very much behind, do not actually focus on learning outcomes. Now, we have worked with several governments, and those large numbers that you see are really reach numbers, not impacted numbers. So when we work with large numbers of schools, big whole state, what we want is for the government to commit itself to, let's say, a 3-year program or 5-year program, to change policy to make sure that there is a sustainable difference or sustained difference in the actual learning levels in a simple sort of way. And that doesn't happen. And these changes are very random. They're not necessarily based on anything particularly important. Sometimes it's just the change of the officer and so on. So continuity and commitment to goals from within the government is the biggest challenge of working at scale with the governments. Once you start working, there are some operational issues, but all those arise out of lack of commitment of the government to the outcomes. If that is fixed, most other things can be fixed.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. So to Praveen Kankta, I have a question. The question about the low fee private school came up in the previous discussion. This is obviously a really important feature of the education sector in India. So the question is, sort of how to achieve these education outcomes in both the public and private sectors, and what in the experience from Central Square Foundation and what you've been observing in India, how do these two the low cost private schools compare in terms of the public schools, and how can decision makers really work to achieve these education outcomes across both public and non-state sectors?
Sure. Thanks, Emily. I'll start with a slightly more humble admission that we don't know, in the sense that there is no state in India which has reliably and over a period of time improved education outcomes. We also know that private schools don't improve education outcomes, like with the increase in privatization, and I think Pankaj was alluding to that. We haven't seen the increase in, let's say, outcomes, etc. What we do have is, I think, a bare bones architecture that, if put in place, could possibly over a period of time improve outcomes. One, which Madhav already mentioned, is a political commitment which is sustained over a period of time. But I think there are also some specific things which are, like, say, follow-ons there. One, for example, we don't have reliable, regular education data at a system level. ASER, of course, produces an excellent report. The government has its own survey. And often you find out that not only there is a difference in terms of methodology, of course there is, but even the relative performance of states varies a lot. So therefore, if I'm a decision maker, I always get confused between which one to follow. The second point is regarding the incentives. If you look at, for example, any of the rankings which get published on education system, the government of India recently launched 2 such rankings. They only talk about the government schools' performance. And this is very important because India does not have, at a system level, reliable measurement of private schools' education outcomes. So if I'm a bureaucrat, I'm only incentivized to focus on improving the government school system, but not all children. And we know the data, the government's own data talks about 45% of children going into private schools. And currently, from a policymaker's perspective, it is a little bit of a blind spot. The third is we need to start early. We know that the learning gaps begin early. We also know that it is extremely difficult at a system level to close the gaps later on. And therefore, both for public and private system, we need to start early. And last, I would say, which is both applicable for public and private system, is that the good thing about India is that you have about 37 units now. And each one of them are fairly autonomous to come up with their own programs and their own policies within the larger ambit of what the laws and sometimes the union's regulation define. Let your states be the laboratories for reform. I would be very wary, and we've seen in the past how horribly wrong we've gone, when you completely scale something without at least one of large Indian states actually showing the proof of concept. And this is maybe where the DIPS can play a very important role. Large-scale implementation sustained over a period of time, and then see what other states can learn from it. So at least this is what I would put as a bare bones architecture. Of course, private schooling is slightly more complicated because government doesn't. and therefore you have slightly limited policy and implementation levels to influence them. But at least if you can focus on these 3-4 points, starting early, right incentives, ensuring that there is a system level data on both public and private over a period of time, you can at least ensure a good start. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I really like this discussion. So back to Dr. Chavan. So at Praton, the ASAR survey has been developed and used to collect education data, outcomes data across India. Let's talk a little bit about sort of the centrality of data, and that's obviously come into the conversation in points raised by all of the previous panelists, in particular Kate. But sort of what can be done in India by decision makers really to build the support of the use of outcomes data, and how do you think that what the role is of impact bonds around that?
Well, I think the question should be what should be done to make sure that the decision makers use the data more effectively. And that is where there is some improvement. When we started the ASAR surveys, in the early days, people did not know what to make of it, and a lot of NGOs were opposed to it. Governments were not sure whether what we were saying was right or wrong. People in the opposition in those days now are in power, and they used to hold the government responsible for some of the learning outcome data. And some of them are talking about learning outcomes now, but we don't know that they will actually, use the data for policy making or for tweaking what is going on in the field. So as Praveen pointed out, there are different methods of measuring. First of all, there's a lot more measurement of learning outcomes these days in government schools than before. But again, the methods used are different. So actually, I don't mind if the methods are different. That's okay. But they have to now start looking at what their method says, and realistically speaking, is it showing any improvement or not? And be honest about it. Unfortunately, there's no third-party evaluation in something like this. If there is yes, you can always say government is a third party, and so the government will publish data that is more honest. Well, it's possible. But I think this is what we need to do. The government really needs to talk about data more openly. A lot of surveys are carried out in state governments, but they are never published. These figures never come out. So I think transparency in data doesn't matter if you don't use the ASAR information, but whatever the government is measuring should be available to the outside world through service providers, other policy advisors, and so on and so forth.
So this is something that we are thinking about a lot in our research currently here at the Center for Universal Education, is this sort of idea that you can collect all the data that you want, but if it's not putting to use, then it's not making a difference. And so I guess I'm curious, I'd like to maybe push you a little bit further to think about sort of what do you think are the barriers to the data being actually analyzed and utilized and action being taken? And is it about the education? Is it about capacity? Where's sort of the missing link?
I didn't quite understand. Where is the missing link between publishing the data and using the data? Is that what you're asking me?
The missing link between sort of the collection of the data and actually putting that data to use for decision makers.
Yeah, so the missing link is the goal. If your goal is to make sure that by 5th grade all children should be reading fluently, then you have a reason to measure and then use the data. But if you're generally just measuring information, so you are collecting how many schools have toilets and how many schools have water and so on, that will be collected. And actually that has been effective, where you said that, okay, so many schools do not have toilets for girls, and so we want to build toilets for girls, and that has been effective. But similarly, if you set goals and say that this is the goal against which I want to start measuring my learning outcomes, then that data will be used. Now, unfortunately, in the national assessment surveys that the NAS that is being done, there's a ranking, but the data is not transparent. It doesn't say how many can read and how many can comprehend and what can they do. It's not available to us. And so I think setting the goal and then seeing how far you've come, that's in some ways that is what the impact bond is saying, that you want to say set the goal and measure and see if this is done. So in some ways that is, in fact, that is how we started ASER. ASER means impact, if you know. So did you know that? So the meaning of ASER, ASER, Annual Status of Education Reported, we could have named it just about anything, but it had to have some meaning. So ASER, although some people say ASER, it is ASER, the impact of what the government is doing. That's what we are out to measure. And the measurement says it's not having an impact. In fact, when we started measuring, the numbers looked a little better than what they were 5 years later. So I think that is exactly what they have to do. If the government declares that from now on, 5 years from now, all children in 5th grade will be doing this or whatever learning outcomes, and say, okay, you hold us responsible to that, then the measurement will have some meaning. Otherwise, you won't.
Great. So really setting a focus on what those outcomes should be. So I'm going to turn back to Praveen. So one of Central Square Foundation's focus is around innovation and technology in education. And we discussed a little bit about using technology in measuring outcomes. And I thought Kate gave an excellent an explanation of and her thoughts around sort of when technology might or might not be appropriate. I'd love to hear from you, Praveen, what you think the role is of technology in measuring education outcomes in India, and how that relates to this broader outcome financing discussion.
Sure. No, like if you ask me personally, I think it can play an absolutely catalytic role. Because if you see, and maybe this relates also to the first question about how to improve learning outcomes at scale. One of the interventions that we know has a high potential for improving learning outcomes for both public and private schools is providing information about the school quality to parents. There have been research studies in Pakistan, Punjab. There have been some research studies in India, in Ajmer, which have shown that providing information about the school quality to parents leads to improvement not only in the public schools, in the private schools, but also in the public schools. Now, the biggest challenge that you face in providing information at scale is two. One, that any school quality has to include both outcomes and processes. And we know that it is extremely difficult to get process level data because school monitoring in India, we don't have an infrastructure for school monitoring. There are no school monitors, or the numbers are very less, and it's very difficult to train them. So it is very difficult to measure school quality on processes across both government and private schools. Second, when you start to measure learning outcomes in a census-based assessment, it is very easily gained. So we have seen in India, time and again, governments trying to measure the quality of education by testing all children. And we know it is like the data is mostly garbage. One of the key things which technology can play a role is actually solving this problem. So now you can reliably provide the information about the school and the students and collect it, for example, through a tablet. Because the questions can be randomized, it would be very hard for the system or the teacher or the school to gain. No, we interestingly have run a experiment with government of Andhra Pradesh in one of their districts. So this was about 2,000 plus schools. The government administered a census-based assessment of all children in class 4 using a tablet. So about 30,000 students got tested using the tablet. Some students got tested without a tablet. And we found out that it was possible to collect at a system level the reliable results. And the evaluation was done by JPAL. And the final study is going to be published in some time. But I think if you just zoom out of it and think about, if we are able to provide each parent about the quality benchmarks of both the school and the student, it can have an absolutely catalytic effect. And technology can easily, ensure that the test is not gained, which in a country of about 1.5 million schools is a very, very big factor. So this is more when you're talking in terms of government's intervention. Technology absolutely has a role to play. Even mobile phones, for example, in India are ubiquitous right now. And Google, for example, recently launched an app called Bolo to test the child's fluency through a mobile phone application. Now, if I am even an illiterate parent, I can use the mobile phone application in order to find out what the true learning level of my child is, especially on something orality, which, let's say, is very difficult to do for an illiterate parent. So absolutely, I think technology has a big role to play in India. Yeah, but it requires a lot more experimentation before you can scale it.
Great, wonderful. Thank you both so much for your contributions. I think it really has enriched the discussion and thinking a little bit more about the India context with all of your expertise, obviously for many years working in the sector in India. I know that we had a couple more questions that weren't answered in the previous. If anybody has any questions to these panelists or to the previous panelists, please write them now in the Q&A box. We have a couple minutes left. There was one question that I wanted to answer, which was that there were, somebody asked to what extent are RCTs being used in the impact bonds sector. So we are tracking that in our Brookings Global Impact Bonds database, all of the facts and figures about all of the impact bonds. And in that, we see that really only a handful actually of impact bonds globally are using randomized controlled trials or quasi-experimental design. Of the social impact bonds, the majority of those are in the United States. And we are starting to see some more being done in the developing country context. The majority of impact bonds are using pre and post tests, collecting data, either administrative data, validated administrative data, or program-specific data. Another question that came was, in the context, who do you see as potential outcome funders? So I wanted to give an opportunity to the other panelists also to potentially answer that question if they wanted to. I think it's really interesting to think about, obviously in the Indian context, who may, just given the outsized challenge in India that we talked about earlier in the presentation in terms of out-of-school children, out-of-school girls, and low learning achievement, across the country and particularly high in some states. What does this look like at scale? Who are the potential other service providers that could be engaged? There are a number of impact investors in India who could potentially engage. Are there particular states that might participate in outcome-based financing? I thought that the point that I think perhaps it was Dr. Chavan that maybe you raised, or maybe it was Praveen, I can't recall, I can't see from my notes, raised the point that perhaps one model to be used would be starting with one state at a time and having sort of a demonstration effect, and building this out. And clearly, we see with the experience of the Educate Girls Impact Bond, a sort of a demonstration effect with one service provider engaging, and now with the Quality Education India DIB really expanding to many more service providers and outcome funders. So I just want to open it up to any of the panelists if they have some thoughts around, who could engage in the Indian context, in the space, to really push forward this agenda of achieving education outcomes. Perhaps Abha?
Yeah, I'm happy to give it a go. Madhav said that government was the most important stakeholder, and I will fully endorse that. But I genuinely believe that every funder can be an outcome funder. It is not, outcome funding is grant funding, but which is linked to results. And if we can create a mindset shift in every funder who's funding education to align with results and to align with outcomes, you actually then have a shift that doesn't only mean that government's got to take on the challenge, but that every form of funding is more responsible. And to me, actually, the real big idea within impact bonds is not the impact bond alone. It is about the culture of shifting the way grant funding works. And if we can enable that through one impact bond scale and say to any grant funder, CSR or otherwise, that this is a good way to think about the way you deliver programs as against giving funding upfront and not checking whether the children have had any learning outcomes, not collaborating with government, not looking at testing, not working with specialist players like Central Square Foundation who are leading thinking in this, not collaborating, I think you aren't doing your job. You aren't meeting the gap that is there. So the ideas of collaboration, the ideas of focusing on results sit within impact bonds. We don't need to scale impact bonds. We need to change the culture of giving to the sector. And I think there is enough money out there already. If it can do that, we have the answer within India itself. And I mean, we also represent the diaspora. They would also be a willing partner, and every other foundation is able to join hands. But it's a cultural and a mindset shift away from straightforward grant to saying we really care about what happens at the end. And in that, we all have to be partners to obviously the big work that government also has to do in its own mindset shift. So
fantastic. You took my closing remarks. So I'm wondering if anybody else wants to respond real quickly. If not, I will jump into closing remarks as we should be closing this up. Any other panelists? Nope. All right. So thanks to all of you for this really fantastic discussion today. I think you all really highlighted the importance of focusing on outcomes. This is really about something that we think here and we've observed in our research at Brookings as we're looking at all of the impact bonds across the world, that this is really about systems change and mindset shift. As Abha was saying, it's really about thinking about, all right, what is it that we want to see at the end of the day? This is the story about the human beings, the young children who are receiving these services. What do they need? And really understanding that better, allowing service providers to have the flexibility to figure out what those needs are, to really course adjust and manage adaptively so that they can best serve the populations. And I think really improving the ability of this focus on outcomes to really improve collaboration and align incentives across multiple stakeholders who all have a rich perspective and contribution to the sector and to bring to the table. So we really hope to see and are excited to see India really leading the way in this outcome focus with 3 impact bonds already. I think more on the way, and just I think this outcome focus mindset shift, which is really about the systems change. So thank you all again for all of your fantastic contributions. Thanks to all of our audience members who have joined us in this webinar from all over the world at all times of day. We appreciate you being here with us for this webinar. Tune in for future webinars and events, and please go to our website at Brookings. If you Google impact bonds and Brookings, you will come to our website that has all of our now 7 reports. We're happy to, very excited to publish our report today. And please feel free to reach out if you have any further questions and or curious to learn more. So thank you all again, and have a wonderful day, evening, night.